So Dr. Lotto, want me to go ahead with the fall?
Sure. Let me just preface your comments and your presentation with again a thanks to you, the academics team, the chairs and co-chairs of each of the 14 subcommittees of the work groups, including many of our stakeholders from around the county that are assisting us in this work. Because this is not easy work. As we have said before on a number of occasions, we've never had schools closed before, and therefore we've never had to go through a reopening. And go through reopening that focuses on the health and safety of our students and staff first, and then build programming around that. And so that continues to be our focus. We will continue to focus on three large concepts that we've talked about in the past, and that's fully online if that becomes necessary, or that is necessary based on decisions made at the state level, the governor's level, and the Maryland Department and Anne Arundel County Departments of Health, as well as so we could be completely virtual. We could be 100% back in the classrooms and back in the buildings and brick and mortar as we have in the past, and then somewhere in between. And those are the hybrid models that the work groups have really been sort of running down, looking at what other counties are doing, what other states are doing, and what other countries are currently doing as they've begun to reopen their schools. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. McMahon to walk through some of the thoughts that and the work of the committees.
Thank you, Dr. Lotto. So as you said, what are our key considerations? Well, there are the three possibilities that Dr. Lotto outlined. And then what is driving us? Well, the health and welfare of our students and our faculty and our staff, right? That's the driver, the big driver. But we also need to understand, how do we meet the needs of all students, especially those students who fall into that opportunity gap, right? Our most vulnerable students. So some of the things that are going on in the background that you won't hear necessarily me delineate in detail today, but in the background, we are going one-to-one with Chromebooks. Every student with a Chromebook, not by the time school starts necessarily, but shortly thereafter. And we are right now engaged, matter of fact, as we speak, many teachers are looking at one of our new learning management system opportunities. We're involved in an RFP process and really looking at over several vendors to get a new learning management system. And then finally, one of the big initiatives is a K-5 backpack. We recognize that if in any way we're virtual at any time during the fall semester, we are going to need students to have some elements where a teacher can know that all those students have that element in their backpack. And so we're looking at a K-5 backpack that has some various manipulatives and composition books and art supplies and some various things that are needed so that all students have access to these materials when we move forward with learning in the fall, no matter if they're at home or in school in some fashion. We know we're going to have to address the parent, the employee, and the public expectations. We absolutely know that. And communication is going to be critical in all of this, and transparency. So with that, let me tell you about the fall committees. You know from prior presentation, there are 14 committees. I'll give you a chance to look at them. And you may say, that's an awful lot of committees to get work done. Well, you've got to remember, we need expertise. There are people leading these committees that have expertise in these areas. And then we need the expertise of any one committee on all the committees. So we really did a twofold process to make sure we populated these committees so that no matter when people meet, there's a driving force, a focused effort. And then there's also folks on that committee that know a lot about other work of the system and other needs, so that we don't have to keep coming back to a home base to check for understanding. And in fact, the committees are doing extremely well because of that. The committees don't only have Anne Arundel County Public School employees, they also have community members from various groups that have a relationship with Anne Arundel County Public Schools. So that's exciting. As you look at these committees, you'll see 4 of the groups in red. When we look at them, we know those are the committees where if they say a model that we're looking at doesn't work, it may be actually a deal breaker. So why the 4 in red? Well, the 4 in red because of this. So HR and employee relations is all about staffing in our bargaining units. And if we choose a model where we're going to have difficulty with staffing, then that may be a deal breaker. Same with facilities. We choose a model where we don't have the custodial staff or the cleaning capabilities in a timely enough fashion. That may be a deal breaker. Food, nutrition, and services and transportation are one committee. You may think to yourself, why together? Because actually they complement each other very nicely. They do a lot of the same services. Different ends of the spectrum, but same processes. And transportation especially. If we can put 12 students on a bus and no more come the fall, well then transportation determines whether or not some models work or they don't work, just from a timeliness fashion of bus pickup and drop off at schools. And then finally, childcare. We know childcare is an issue that people have been talking about, and families need childcare in many cases if you have under a 12-year-old in your home. And so we know that some of the models are going to be more challenging than others. So with that, I'll tell you all these committees are off to the races. They've been working very, very hard. And there are chairs of those committees that talk to one another. And then there is a steering committee that has a liaison to each of these committees. And so we're doing well in that sense. With that, we move on and we say, let us tell you about, as I just spoke, some of the things that we know, because a lot of school systems around the nation are starting to put up where they're going for the fall. We're not quite ready with where we're going, but as you may know, that as you build models, it's as important to know what you can't do as it is to know what you can do. So I'm going to show you a couple things where we've determined a few areas that are no longer being considered. So split sessions. Sounds very exciting because you could get an AM and a PM session in a school. But actually, it's very difficult. And those deal breaker committees that I talked about, transportation would have a very difficult time bringing 12 students on a bus in the morning and then picking them up again to take them home at 11:30 in the afternoon, and then picking up another group to get them back by maybe 1 o'clock for a PM session, and then taking them home again in the afternoon. So transportation says very difficult to do split sessions. So does facilities for all the cleaning, because in fact, when we change students from any one area, any one classroom, we have to do serious cleaning when you change students or change a teacher, change the people who are going to occupy that room. Staffing gets a little tricky because now you need twice as many staff members involved in the split session as you would in the in-person if it was one session. And finally, childcare. Although childcare seems like, well, if students were in the school every day, wouldn't that be okay? Well, an AM/PM childcare situation is tough for some working families because your young child may get home 11:30 in the morning, or they may be home all morning and get picked up at 12 noon to go in for a 1 o'clock start. So childcare becomes an issue as well. So I took a long time to explain that to say some of the models stop working, and so we take them off the consideration list. So split sessions, as well as an ABC rotation. Okay, so we move on. While Dr. Alato said that it's really important, we're listening to the CDC guidelines and the health department and Arundel County Health Department. We also know that we're looking widely at what people are doing around the nation and the world, as he articulated. But we also knew we needed to hear from our families. And so as we looked, we put a survey together, and we're very proud of this. 45,000 families responded to our survey, and that represents over 79,000 of our students. That's an amazing response rate. And so people did get engaged, and they did decide to tell us what they were looking at for the fall, what their biggest desires were for the fall. And so with that, the first one is their model choice. And we, of course, said, and if you took the survey, you know, we said, knowing what you know now, recognizing that may change come the fall. What would you want to do for your family and your students? And so this is what families told us. They said, basically, we'd love to be in person. If we can't be in person, 20% of them said, I want to be home. Home online, virtual learning. And 32% said, I don't mind virtual learning. Virtual learning is good. I'd like to send them a little bit, that hybrid model. We call it virtual plus. We call it virtual plus because really, if you really think about this, every student is a virtual student. The reason they're all virtual because at any time during the fall semester, any school or perhaps the district may end up having to be virtual again. So we have to assume every student is a virtual student, and then some students, this virtual plus, some students will be virtual and they'll go in 2 days a week, potentially, in some of the hybrid models. So with that, what about childcare? We were hearing a lot about childcare. So we asked a lot of questions about childcare, but this is a highlight today. And the highlight is that 75% of our families say we either don't need it, we don't have childcare needs, or we've already secured it. So we have 25% of our families still looking. That's still a big number. That's not small, but it is smaller than we thought it might have been. So something to watch for. And our child care committee is really critically working on this, and they're doing their own survey of our child care providers across Anne Arundel County, many of whom have closed their doors due to the fact that they can't operate right now with the low numbers of students because of social distancing. So it's a really tricky, complex set of variables that we're dealing with respect to childcare. We move into technology because that was an area in the spring that really had us worried. So we know from the survey that 98% of our families that took the survey said they have internet. Now here, we ask a little bit something a little differently. We said, come the fall, if your student needs a Chromebook, needs a technology device during the day, what kind of access do they have to it? Because we know in the spring, many of them were using their family's equipment. And if mom, dad, or their guardian, their caretaker goes back to work and takes the laptop with them, they wouldn't necessarily have it. So we specifically asked this question. And good news is that 76% of them said, we're good, that our student would have access to it during the day if need be. But it's still worrisome that some of them have a little less access. Good news is our plan, Chromebook, one-to-one distribution, should take care of this. And we move on and we said we really wanted to get at what the reopening priorities of our families were. So the data have natural points. So while there were about 8 to 10 selections on reopening priorities, 4 of them were over the 50% level, which means over 50% of the families said, this is important to me. They were able to pick 3 things. 4 of them came out over the 50% level, and here they are. They care about the disinfecting. They want things clean, both our schools and our buses. They want to make sure that we socially distance their children, their students, and we have all the safety requirements in place. They want to make sure that we are prepared for academic recovery, and they want to make sure that we're communicating with them. Those are their priorities. Now, when we move on to the learning priorities, at 80% of the families said robust academic learning. Please, please, please. So I think that we were basically saying, this virtual world, if we do end up in it for any reason, or if we end up in a hybrid world or an in-person world, we want robust academic learning. Absolutely. We want to have our students being able to communicate and interact with other students. And we want that enrichment. They're missing that, they're missing their sports and their clubs and their arts. So those are the things that they wanted for learning, for their learning priorities. And then we moved on to their health priorities. There were 16 options here. These 4 options. In the health priority, the question was, what's very, very highly important to you? What's neutral in your mindset? And what's of low importance to you? So these 4 out of the 16, the high importance outweighed the combination of neutral and low. So we know these 4 are the largest contenders for what our families are worried about. They definitely want to make sure we have the ability to wash hands in our schools. They want outdoor recess. They'd like to have social distancing in the classroom, and they are interested in the temperature checks. So we're feeling really great, and we thank the families, the stakeholders of Anne Arundel County Public Schools, for answering the survey, because not only this information, this was highlights today, but we have a lot more, and that will be put up by the beginning of next week for all the public to see. We have to make the graphs work and everything, and have to deal with that, but it will be up public. But for today, what we'll say is the committees are doing the work. As Dr. Arlotto said, we're shooting for an answer by the end of the month. And along the way, we will keep the public updated on the aacps.org/fall2020 website. I thank you for your time, and I know you may have some questions.
Dr. Arlotto, do you have anything to add before we open up for questions to the board?
No, I think we can jump right into questions. Thank you, Dr. McMahon. Thank you again. As I began with your team, really, it's the entire system, because we're all engaged in this. There is not a department that is not part of this process. Again, because we've never closed, we've never had to reopen, and know that these are conversations that are happening around the state, and excuse me, and around the country. I know that my colleagues, the superintendents, were meeting with Dr. Salmon earlier this morning. I was unable to be part of that meeting because of board commitments and our board meeting. But also I was on a call earlier this week with superintendents from around the country, talking about and sharing ideas about how each of us around the country intends to reopen. And that was an interesting conversation. And everybody is right where we are. Nobody has final answers. We are waiting, and I think it's important. I know our board members know that, but I'll reiterate for our board members and the larger public that we are closed officially. Our superintendent of schools for the state closed us on March 16th. We are not yet officially open. It will be the state superintendent of schools along with the governor that will reopen schools, and they will also give us some parameters around how schools can reopen around the state. We have not yet received that information. When we do, that will help us really zone in on a particular model about how we'll open schools in the fall. So with that, thank you, President Corkadell, and we're glad to take questions.
Great. Thank you so very much, Dr. Arlotto. We're going to go roll call on this one because I know multiple members have questions and comments to make. Mr. Ladd? I'm sorry, Ms. Hummer?
Yes, thank you. That was a lot of information to take in, and I think it reflects what everyone is hearing in their emails and on the street and everything, that everyone's very divided on this, and that there's not going to be any easy solution or anything that makes everyone happy. If I recall, when I filled out the survey, there was a question, and maybe I'm not recalling right, but will there be an option? I know transportation is a big issue if we have to limit the number of students on a bus. Will we have a way to ask and find out from parents if they are willing or able to drive their students to school rather than have them on a bus, so that could help alleviate some of those restrictions? Is that going to be something that's explored further?
I know the Transportation Committee is looking at that. At some point in time when the models are built, asking the public not only the model that they want, but also asking them questions about transportation, childcare, various things. We'll have to go out again, because that will make a difference depending on how many people are willing or able to transport.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's my only question now. Thank you very much for the update. I know y'all are working hard on this.
Thank you, Ms. Hummer. Mr. Smith.
Yes, thank you, Dr. McMahon, because that was very, very informative. Because like everybody's been saying, this is the question of the century. You know, how are we going to reopen schools? You know, so my question is, if we do the fully virtual, how will it look? Will we go back to how we did it in the spring semester, or will we do like school online?
Right. So it's a great question, Mr. Smith. It will definitely be e-teaching and learning, right? Electronic teaching and learning, not just, it will have the synchronous times for courses, for classes to meet. There's a lot of guidance nationally. I mean, you would have, if you were in high school as you are, you would have normally on an A day been in 4 90-minute periods. That's not suggested in a distance learning motif. It's for a high school student, it's more like 45 minutes. But still very robust. And then with supported learning time in the off hours. And so, yes, you'll have an opportunity for that. You'll also have an opportunity for clubs as well. And so we want to make sure that if we had to go virtual in any way, that it's a robust virtual environment. And Dr. Lotto and I were talking yesterday about things that are happening around the nation that are exciting in the virtual world for secondary students. And so people are talking about that on the academics committee. They're talking about that in many of the committees. What can we do to make sure, no matter what happens, our students are getting amazing learning and amazing support?
Now that makes sense for the core class. And so my next question is about like encores and extracurriculars. Like, what are we going to do about the technology classes, you know, like tech ed or band, you know?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were just engaged in a conversation yesterday about simulated learning. And we have a couple of opportunities to explore simulated learning where you can actually build things in a augmented reality or a simulated world. And so we're looking deeply into that for this summer. In some cases like the CAT centers, some of that learning is very tough if you're just solely virtual. So while the content can be learned and the concepts, it's the skills. So we're concerned about that. Absolutely.
Now with special education, how are we going to try to get that, like recreate that one-on-one time?
Yeah. So the one-on-one time, there's some amazing things happening in the special education world that's really positive. Many of our special education families, our families who have special needs students, are telling us that this virtual environment, many of them are telling us it's really working for them very, very well. They get the one-on-one time either with Google Voice and a phone, or they get it in a virtual world. They get more smaller segments than they might have, individual segments than they might have in a classroom with 5 or 6 students. And so while I would say virtual isn't the panacea, for some students it is working. For others, we are looking deeply, the special ed committee is looking deeply at all the different options that we might be able to offer families. So some families could go ahead with some of their offerings in a virtual world, and others maybe really have to come face to face. So those are good questions you're asking. We're asking them too every day.
Now my last question is probably the second biggest question of the century. You know, what are we going to do about sports? Students have talked to me about that. You know, they want to get back on the field. They're ready to get out the house. So if school were to be virtual, right, fully virtual, is there a possibility that we would have in-person sports?
So Dr. Love?
So let me jump in. I think the short answer is no. If a decision is made to go 100% online, that decision is really going to be made at that state level, saying you cannot bring students together. If I can't bring them together in a classroom, I'm not going to be able to bring them together on a sports field, right? We are hoping that we are not in 100% virtual, that we're either going to be back in buildings in some way, shape, or form, either 100% or in some kind of hybrid version. If we if we continue to move along the continuum that we are here in the state of Maryland in terms of the number of COVID cases, that's being watched carefully by the Department of Health and the governor's office, and if and when the governor moves us from stage 2 to stage 3. But to expand on that question a little bit, Mr. Smith, our athletics are overseen by the MPSSAA. That's the state organization that sets the rules and sets the guidelines for high school athletics. And so that organization is overseen by the Maryland State Department of Education and the state superintendent, Dr. Salmon. They have been forward thinking, and they've gotten some, I'll use the term waivers, of some of the rules in governing sports, just in case we need them. So the state, they've already brought these, they brought this to the State Board of Education, who has approved some waivers, so that, meaning things like, when sports have to start. Maybe we don't start in August, maybe because of things we could start later in the year. The number of contests in a year is dictated by MPSSAA, and that's been waived. So because we might have to alter schedules so we can get some kind of sports in the fall and the winter and the spring, all dependent upon what's best in terms of health and safety for our students, coaches, and staff, right? And so they've been forward thinking. So now there are some of those waivers that are in place. Don't have to use them yet, but we may need to use them into the future. So we hope to be able to bring the students together in some way, shape, or form. Certainly, we'd love to have a football season and a volleyball season and a bocce season, but we have to. Time will tell. But the state organization is keeping a close eye on it, and then they'll dictate much of that to us and our athletic directors.
Thank you, Dr. Arlo. And if all else fails, we can always just play Madden. Thank you, Dr. McMahon, Dr. Arlo.
And there you have it, right?
Oh my goodness.
Those are
Mr. Smith, you're already shaping up to be quite a pleasure and a great addition to the board. Thank you so very much. Miss Ellis.
Thank you. Thank you again for a very helpful presentation. I do have a few questions. First of all, I apologize. A chainsaw just started down the street, so please let me know if it's a problem. Okay, so the first question on the survey was parents' comfort or what their preference is for school in person or online or a combination. And while it's easy to say that overwhelmingly parents chose in person, in fact, 51% of parents chose not in person, but maybe some variation or all online, right?
Yes.
So I guess, Dr. Arlotto, my first question is there a possibility, a scenario where the state superintendent will require all students to be back in school, basically sort of as normal, full time?
So certainly that is a possibility, right? Just like she can, the law is already explicit that students have to be in school at certain ages, right? There is mandatory attendance. And as of now, that's not in effect because schools are not quote unquote open. And that was the case in the spring, right? Because schools were closed and we were virtual. So certainly the state superintendent could say, based on all of the input, CDC guidelines, Maryland Department of Health, the governor's office, I'm declaring schools are 100% open. She certainly could do that.
Okay, so considering all of the effort the whole school system has gone through to create an atmosphere for students to be able to do school remotely, if the superintendent were to make that statement that all students are back in school full-time, does that, are we not still able to offer an option to parents if the student, in other words, if we have a robust online program, can that just be one of the programs we offer? I'm trying to understand if we will have flexibility in that scenario.
So I hope that we'll have flexibility. Online learning has to be approved through the state of Maryland.
Mm.
We can't just offer an online program and say, yes, if you want to take it, you can take it. It has to be approved through the state of Maryland.
Okay.
But that said, I would suspect, Mrs. Ellis, that we will be allowed that option because we will, even if the state superintendent fully opens schools, we will have some families and some staff that are immunocompromised or otherwise at risk and will not come back. They will choose to not want to return their child or themselves, the staff member, to school. So I'm sort of banking on, and that's the reason that Dr. McMahon talked about, in the background, we're still working on one-to-one, a learning management system, having enough Chromebooks, and having a robust learning opportunities so that we are probably going to have some people, even if we go back 100% to answer your question, this hypothetical, that are going to want to still learn from home, and we need to have that as an option. I'm hoping that the state superintendent would allow us that option. I think she would, because she gets it. She realizes that not everybody's just going to walk back into a building based on the circumstances that are at hand. So I believe that we would have that option. That would be my best guess.
Okay. And I want to, I guess another question is, could we potentially, let's say we're mostly online, virtual teaching. Could we focus on certain groups like we've talked about with special education, but focus our efforts on getting certain students in without having to open up for all students? Again, going back to the CAT students, a student who's learning to repair an engine or cut hair just can't really happen without getting their hands on. So could we potentially just identify, okay, these students really need to get in, and even if they rotate in and out to make those groups smaller. I mean, I've seen amazing things. I have kids who are arts students. They're in PVA, and it is it's certainly ideal for them to be in person. But we've seen some amazing demonstrations of art happening online, where entire ensembles come together and perform, and it's different, but it's amazing. So, but I'm concerned about those students who really need to get their hands on what they're doing.
Right.
So I think so the answer is yes. That is part of the conversation with the committees. Part of the ongoing conversation we've had really since day one is, if and when we're allowed to open, who are we going to focus on first, right? And so it could be our youngest learners. It could be students with special needs. And the CAT centers are not every program, but many of the programs are sort of ready built for, they're already small classes, and many of those rooms are large, so we could spread the students out.
Right.
Right. Cosmetology, maybe not so much, but that is a possibility as well. And you know, the kitchens for baking or for culinary, not as easy to spread them out because of the confines. But the carpentry shop, very different. It's a big wide open room, and those classes by design, because of the needed safety measures in place for those classes, are small anyway. So that's absolutely, we've had those conversations about the CAT centers as a possibility of, if we can't open, those are places that we will try and do that first.
Okay. As far as other possible variations with, for example, with magnets, we bus students all over the district. So if transportation is the concern for one of the scenarios, is it possible that the magnet classes themselves could go online so that students can be well, but then they go to, I guess a magnet student would either have to go to their home school for some classes, or that's
So
not an option,
I
right?
think of a magnet student, it's not much different than a student with singletons in their schedule, right? You know, maybe you have a singleton AP class, AP physics, right? And it's often a singleton, similar to a magnet program. The bottom line is secondary, much, much more challenging to deal with in a hybrid mentality than it is to either go totally virtual or totally in person.
Right.
And so we're grappling with magnets as part of a big family of the secondary programs where it just gets more difficult to think
Right.
about a hybrid story.
Right. And then I had an idea. This is something I've been thinking about for a while, and it was really great to see the numbers. And by the way, the participation in that survey is mind-blowing to me. That's that's a good way to get a real sense of how parents feel when you've got 94% participation. So that being said, I believe it was about 25% that do have childcare concerns. So that seems like a number that we can focus on. And I've had this idea about creating some sort of a network, maybe online, to match people up with other people who, first of all, might be willing to take on a family in their home because they normally have a child care facility that's not operating, something like that. Or a neighbor might be home with their kids and be willing to take, the neighbor down the street or something like that. If we could create some sort of network to match people up. I mean, I know a lot of people are not working right now because of the situation and could use that way to spend their time and perhaps even earn money.
It's an interesting comment you're making. The Child Care Committee has been talking to child care providers, both in-home child care providers as well as small business, and then the larger daycare licensed facilities. And what they're hearing is that at the moment, many of them are closed. They're closed for lots of different reasons. Some are the social distancing is problematic. Others are because they don't have the staff. They lost staff too, and they lost the ability to have staff. So your idea is an interesting one because the nature of the beast will be that we have to figure this out. It's a community challenge, not just a school's challenge, right? The other piece we are doing right now, and our equity committee is really leading some of this effort and reminding us that although childcare, that 25%, it could be when we disaggregate by cluster, that any one of the clusters could be as high as 60%, right? The childcare could be focused in one area as a big need. And so that notion of coming together as a community to solve the childcare issue could be really something we need to do. We'll know more next week when all this data gets disaggregated.
Great. And then finally, I just want to make an observation or offer something to consider, which is that I know we have a lot of parents who feel strongly that students need to be back in the schools, and there's very, very important considerations as far as the social, emotional well-being of our students and the benefits they have with that in-person interaction. But I would caution that depending on the level of social distancing and the measures that have to be taken to carry that out, that could impact the level of benefit that students have with that in-person interaction. In other words, if a student is sitting at a desk behind plexiglass with a mask on, the benefits of that social interaction are greatly diminished. So that has to be part of the consideration, I believe.
I mean, point well taken. One of the things that's being talked about is when we come out with a model, that model has to have some depth and richness to it, because families are going to want to know more than just when the bus comes and when it drops off. They're really going to want to know the quality of the day that their child is going to spend if they send them to school. And so that's what the committees are working on, really trying to flesh out what will happen during those hours.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. Mr. Grannon.
Thank you, President Corkadell. Just a couple of questions. Is the current conversation, to use the terms that you all were using, is the conversation focused on or considering greater needs for in-person learning for K through 5?
The answer is yes. That is absolutely part of the conversation and in answering Ms. Ellis's question earlier, as we focus on where are the greatest needs, we would see elementary as a greater need in getting those students back into the buildings as we consider that. Also understanding that in terms of scheduling and maintenance of the buildings, it's easier at the elementary level in a hybrid model than it is at the secondary level. And that was Dr. McMahon's point in also addressing Ms. Ellis's question. It is the concept of hybrid learning at the secondary level is very, very difficult, because one that we have to consider in health and safety that have as much as you can the children in the same place. Excuse me. Throughout at the elementary level, where you could have a fourth grade, half of that fourth grade class remains in that classroom all day long, versus the secondary level where that high school student has got to move from class to class. We go to math and social studies, and our friends go to English. They're all going to different classes. It's much, much more difficult and complex at the secondary level than it is the elementary level.
Okay, that's cool. Hybrid learning and all virtual with all distance learning is the conversation for K through 5. More of it should be synchronous than was the case the past couple of months. And I don't say that as a criticism. I just say, obviously we were, ramping up to get something online as quickly as possible, with an unforeseen pandemic. And I think people's schedules were such in this initial period that they were more hectic. I think if we're going to be in an all virtual or half virtual, whatever it is, environment in the fall, people's schedules, work-wise and just personally, will be more used to the pandemic. Let's put it that way. So while there were benefits to having a lot of flexibility in when students could do online learning, I think in the initial stages, I think if we were to go forward either with a hybrid model or certainly an all virtual model, that there would be a lot of benefits for a full year of virtual learning to having more synchronous scheduled time when students are supposed to be online doing certain things or actually getting instruction. And I'm just wondering, is that part of the conversation, especially for K through 5?
That is not only part of the conversation, that's part of the planning. That's our goal. We knew that that we were going to have to do some things differently going into the fall than what online learning looked like in the spring. And so absolutely, it's going to be less flexible, to use your word, Mr. Grannon, in that there will be, specific times that, and I'll use high school as an example, right? If my first period of the day is calculus, well, there's going to be a time that I'm going to log on and I'm going to see my calculus teacher and we're going to go through a calculus lesson. And then the rest of the period, and that might be for the first 20 minutes, that might be for the first half hour. And then the rest of the time will be me doing my work. And so absolutely, we know that it needs to be more robust and that students need to see their teachers and teachers need to see their students in real time.
Okay, but in particular for K through 5 as well.
Yes, I used the high school as an example, but absolutely we would be expecting the same at the elementary level.
Especially including reading groups that we didn't do in the springtime. Reading groups would be active, as well as the cultural arts would be there, but all of the disciplines would be represented, and they would have time certain to actually meet their teacher record.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Grannon. Ms. Schulheim?
Firstly, thank you so much for this presentation. Just like the last one, it was very informative. I'm very grateful for the information. A lot of my questions were tackled, but I do still have a couple. So we had that great slide of what we're no longer considering.
Mhm.
And I think that's very important for the broader community as well as board members to know and understand. Like an AM PM sounds great, doesn't work. That's wonderful. So which of the hybrid models at this moment in time seem the most viable?
We're sort of honing in on for the hybrid models 2 days a week of students in school. You've seen that some other counties have released something similar that they're considering. I think Loudoun County, Fairfax County, Queen Anne's County recently put something out. And that seems to be in terms of what sort of the non-starters that Dr. McMahon talked about earlier in her presentation. Those seem to be the ones that we think we can work best with, give the students some time in face-to-face, a couple of days a week, give us time in between in groups to get the buildings clean, and then 3 days of virtual at home. And so that's a model that the committees are really sort of honing in on and tweaking. Dr. McMahon, anything to add to that?
No, that's perfectly right. That's where they're at, and various renditions of that, but definitely the 2 day a week piece.
And to that end, I'm just thinking this through to its final implementation. There would be therefore consistency with regard to childcare. Like every week, my kid is going Tuesday, Thursdays for the first semester. I need to find childcare Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or someone to monitor e-learning on those days.
Correct.
Right.
That'll be my set days. So they're not going to be Tuesday, Thursday one week, and then Monday, Wednesday the next.
No.
I mean, I just see an utter train wreck of a disaster of childcare with that. So I'm glad you all are. Obviously, you've already thought of that. That's fantastic to hear. Would it be so? 3 days would be e-learning, but when I've read of the other plans of other counties, at least what was printed in the media, and one of the days, like Friday or Monday, was specifically a teacher planning day and or something like that. So is that what you're envisioning too? Like that, yes, we'd have these 3 days of e-learning, but it would be, 3 days out of a week to do it. But Friday, my teacher might be in meetings all day or have office hours or something like that, or some combination.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we would, as part of the model, looking at a sort of a 4-day week in terms of teacher face-to-face engagement with their students, with that 5th day being time for professional development, building out their e-classrooms, could be office hours, could be catching up with individual students and following up, professional development, those kinds of things. So yes, that's part of the model.
That's really nice to hear. Okay, so and within that, I guess we'll know more when we get the employee survey results back, because I'm sure one of the questions is, you're a teacher or you're an administrator or a principal or an AP, and what are your needs in terms of childcare to
Yes.
be able to balance the, if you're a second grade teacher and you got two at home, like how are you going to do synchronized, how is that going to work? So do we have questions around that on the employee
Yes, we
service?
do.
Perfect. And with regard to childcare, we asked, I loved the question set, I've already secured it with friends and family. I'm looking, I don't need it, this, that, or the other. Do we have a sense of, I need childcare, but I can't afford it? I didn't see that on the list. Are we thinking about that?
We are thinking about it. And the reason we're thinking about it is because our child care committee is really looking at it. And one of the things that has come up nationwide is that of the people who need child care, who have consistently had it all along, that won't be the issue. It's the new group of people who are going to need child care, potentially going to need child care based on a model, and they traditionally wouldn't have needed it. Or they can't rely on their family because their family is older and compromised in some way. And so they have to change their childcare. So nationally, people are looking at, maybe 20% of a population that wouldn't have needed it, needing it. And so we know that that's an issue, and we know that we have to figure that out. And we know that the employees fall right into that category, just like our families.
Absolutely.
But let me also add that, because I think you asked a great question. And so for the board and the larger public, also, and this will be very unpopular, we as a school system will not be able to solve everybody's childcare needs.
Right.
We got to focus on teaching and learning and the health and safety of our students and staff. So I know that will be unpopular for some. We want to know about the childcare issues. We want to study them. That's the reason it's one of the working committees, because we know that will impact students, staff, and families. And the more we know about it, the more we study it, the better we can create schedules that create less dilemmas for people, right? Less conflict. But we as a school system, you as a board, will not be able to solve all the childcare issues that are out there. We just can't do that. We have to be very honest about that.
100%. Totally agreed. I asked that in part to yield that response so that we're all on the same page.
Absolutely.
I want to solve everyone's problem. I can't do that on a normal day. So how can I do that during a once in a century pandemic day? I cannot. But I'm glad that we are considering that subset of the population in our ongoing thinking and planning. I also want to make clear to the public and to those watching at home that, like Dr. Arlato said, we are not the final decision makers. I get emails every day. I get hit up on social media, open schools, or do this or do that or the other. Good golly, I would love to know what we're doing in the fall. Just like everybody else. And so I just want to drive home that point that we can't scribble outside the lines of what the governor and the state superintendent have going on in terms of their planning or what their decision might be. But as an individual board member who hears from the public on the daily, I hope that if the superintendent or the governor are watching, please let us know as soon as possible so we can plan, because I'm a planner and this drives me absolutely through a wall. And I think it does for most of us. And I think a lot of our families would like to know yesterday what we're doing. Let me going down my list of things. So the 2 days a week is helpful. We already asked questions about busing in the face of the 2 days a week. So I know that is an enormously important issue and it will remain important, especially if the capacity of our buses decreases significantly. So I'm glad we're thinking about that. Nothing else is really popping in my mind at the moment. I'm just really grateful for the 14 committees. I love that we're looking at this holistically, that we're kicking over all the rocks. I'm glad that the communities are involved. I'm really grateful to the senior staff for spearheading this effort and for collecting all of this information. And I very much look forward to seeing the plan when when we know what the plan is and the work of all of those committees. I definitely think that by the end of this, we're going to need to devote a full board meeting to recognitions because the list is growing daily. And I'm just really grateful to the whole team for this. I won't take up any more time. Thank you so much. Michelle, I think you're muted if you're trying to talk.
Yeah, sorry about that. Miss Antwine.
Thank you, President Corkadell, and thank you again, Dr. McMahon and Dr. Arlotto, for this incredible presentation and the work that has gone into something, as Mr. Smith pointed out, is probably the question of the century. So as they were going through and as members were asking questions, I had a list of follow-on questions in addition to my own. I'm very concerned about that huge contingency from the state level and how we move forward based on that. Is there any idea, any inkling about when that decision will be made? Will it be made a day before we're anticipated to start the fall, or what is the plan there based on your meetings with the state superintendent?
She's not indicated when she plans to let us know. So I don't have an answer to that. But we will continue to plan, and then as best we can, we will announce to our public what we plan to do by the end of this month so that people can start to plan around that, knowing that it could change either by what the state does or what's happening nationally with the virus. Things could change, but our plan is to roll out an option or options for parents to let us know which one they want to take advantage of for their children so that we can plan accordingly.
Excellent. And then in your studies, literally around the world to formulate something for Anne Arundel County Public Schools, what are you finding of some of the things that may be uniquely ours, uniquely our need as we formulate these plans?
I haven't come across anything that I would characterize as uniquely ours. It is still because the virus can impact any of us at any time, and so we are following very closely what those countries that are ahead of us in terms of reducing and eliminating the curve, as it were, the vernacular that's used. And so what's happening in China, what's happening in South Korea, what's happening in Denmark, and Finland and Italy as they are reopening schools and learning from them as they're bringing students back into school. So they are social distancing, they are using masks, they are hand washing. Those are the things that appear to be working in those areas. Dr. McMahon, anything to add to that?
No, that's exactly right.
Okay, and if we continue virtually, either in a hybrid fashion or fully, the help desk, it is my understanding the help desk has been greatly overwhelmed with questions from parents and people in the community, as well as their primary duties back to the school system. What are there plans to expand the support for the help desk?
A lot of the committees are talking about that, whether it be a committee that's talking about family support needed in maybe the, I'll say the afternoon and the evening hours, or whether they're talking about faculty support and employee support. But many of the committees are talking about that, including the technology committee, expanding, and not only expanding it, but expanding it in a bilingual nature as well.
Oh, good.
But let me add that, Ms. Antwine, I would not use the word overwhelmed.
No.
I think the help desk has managed it beautifully. We did add some folks, including some that speak a second language to that team, knowing there was going to be a need, right? We've never, and you've heard me talk about this before in the board meetings that we've never handed out technology before that people are taking home, right? All of our help desk has been internal to help people internally. And so we knew that was going to be the case. So we did, Mr. Barlow and his team of technology did a really good job of putting some extra folks on board, some extra techs and others to help with those. But we also know that going one-to-one, we're going to have to create, I'm going to use the term loosely, an office. It won't be an office, but we're going to have to create more and better access for parents and students, because as you hand out Chromebooks, they will break down, they will stop working, they will get dropped, they will get lost, and we're going to have some working mechanisms to replace and repair and then assist people with their Chromebooks. So we're going to have to beef up that help desk, to use your term, going into the future. Just the fact that we're going to be one-to-one, and instead of having 0 Chromebooks leaving our schoolhouses, we'll have 85,000 leaving the schoolhouses.
So you're the educator, so I won't mince words on the terms overwhelmed compared to there's definitely a difference between their primary work and we had full engineers having to do tier 1 work and simultaneously. So that those additional duties, no reflection on what has not been done. I didn't receive complaints. What I received was the fact that additional duties have been added to the help desk support. And so my question was, how are we accommodating that? And if we decide to continue this, how are we planning to expand it? So we'll go with that. I appreciate that response. Then we talk about overcrowding and social distancing. They don't go in the same sentence, right? We were overcrowded prior to COVID. We will have an overcrowding issue as we continue as a developing county. What are the plans if we should go back into a traditional setting to ensure that social distancing is in place, as the parents and the families have requested?
So really the only way to appropriately social distance is to have fewer people in the same location.
Right.
Right. That's you know that, we know that. So that's a really difficult question to answer. If we go back full time and there's a class of 30 in a physics class, there's going to be a class of 30 in a physics class. I won't have extra rooms and extra teachers in that high school to take that 30 and spread them out.
Right.
We just don't have the capacity to do that. So then we'll have to, so the next tier is, keeping a movement around the school building to a minimum, maybe eating lunches in your classroom as opposed to going into the cafeteria, more time outside if we can arrange that so students can get some fresh air and and separate students and staff from each other. But that's a really, you can't have both, right? We've got, if you look at the survey, it's interesting, Ms. Antwine, but not surprising, there are 50% of our families saying they want their children back full-time 5 days a week, but they also want social distancing rules in place. And as you say, the two don't match. You can't do both. You can't have a class of 30 in physics or in 25 in a 4th grade class and keep them appropriately social distance. But we can work to mitigate some of that in case if we do go to, and that's by, again, having students move less. There wouldn't be group work, let's say, right? Students, we would keep them in rows and separated as much as possible within a classroom, as opposed to bringing them together and doing group work where they're now face to face. We would eliminate that. We would do masking. We would do we will do hand washing and sanitizing stations throughout the school building. And so we're ordering those supplies, that PPE, so that we have that available in whatever capacity we do reopen.
Thank you. And then there was, I thought I saw on the chart provided a request for more temperature checks. And wanted to understand, when we talk temperature checks, are we talking about the forehead scanner where they go to the nurse's station each day? Or are they coming into school and the first thing they get is a temperature check before moving forward? How is that going to be administered, if at all?
So it might not be at all from us. The direction we are getting, the conversation we're having at the state level, myself and the other superintendents, is that the Department of Health will most likely, and again, we've not gotten final word on anything, but the Department of Health would be recommending that parents would manage temperature checks. Before a child leaves home, before they get on a bus, it'll be up to the parent to check their child's temperature. And if their temperature, they should know what their normal resting temperature is. And if it's elevated, that child should be kept home. That would be the direction that we would have here in Anne Arundel County and across the state. It would not be at the bus driver taking temperature checks or at the schoolhouse door. The Maryland Department of Health right now is advising the state superintendent that that should be something that's done at home and keep the child, because if the child gets to school and has an elevated temperature, now the child's at school and could possibly infecting others. We'd rather them staying at home if they've got an elevated temperature, and that would be left to the parents. So right now, that's not in our planning. It may be into the future, but that's not part of our planning based on the direction we're getting from the Maryland Department of Health and the Maryland State Department of Education.
Good. And then whether we go in a traditional fashion or we go hybrid or virtually, we will still be virtual in terms of people outside of students and employees. And so I wanted to understand how maybe the parents and the changes for parent interaction at the schools is being considered. For example, our parent-teacher conferences, our parent engagement, if there's something going on with the child, will they still have to do things virtually or set up appointments, or what's the plan for them?
Right now, the plan is that we will do all of that virtually.
Okay.
So we will do parent-teacher conferences, back to school night, because we just don't want to, we want to limit the exposure inside a building. And that's the recommendation sort of we're getting from the health officer, that if you are going to have children back, either full-time or half a class 2 days a week and another half class the other 2 days a week, we want to limit it to just that cohort of students and staff. You don't want to then introduce others, whether it's family. We would limit the use of the buildings from outside groups that normally rent our buildings, for example.
Right.
We would not allow that because we want to, and we also have to have time once the students leave in the afternoon for our building service crew to get in and then clean the buildings thoroughly for the next group of students on the next day. And we would not want outside users in the building. So that's a great question, Ms. Antoine. Thank you so much for asking that. I didn't get a chance to bring that up earlier, but that's an important aspect that, at least in the beginning, if and when we open again, either the hybrid model or full-time, we would be limiting it to students and staff only, our buildings, on an as-needed basis only, and limiting, if allowing at all outside groups to use the buildings so that we can contain those cohorts of people. That's the safest way, the safest recommendation we're getting now from health officials.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And then I want to ask about truancy. I don't anticipate that the state laws for truancy will change no matter how we go back into schools, but I am concerned about, we shared that there will be more stringency applied whether we go back to school physically or we do this virtually. And there will be circumstances where, say, a student didn't get on the computer on time, or they had to share a system, or there was technical difficulties, or in the same fashion, the parents are maybe refusing, or guardians refusing for the children to come to school because of what they've heard in the news or concerns or otherwise. What is the plan? Are the committees addressing truancy and some alternative responses when a child is not participating in school?
One of the committees, especially the committee that deals with instructional data, they are also the committee that deals with attendance, right? And at this point in time, how we take attendance is a critical question, because truancy and attendance go hand in hand. And so, and Dr. Lotto, you might be able to say more, but at this point in time, we don't know exactly at the fall how attendance is going to be taken.
Right.
And so until we define some of the parameters of what it means to attend, the issue of how we handle it will be different. But ultimately, we'll follow some of the same procedures we would follow in the in-person world. Certainly, the school administrators will be acknowledging on a daily basis, once the decision is made, how attendance is taken. They will be looking to evaluate and support students attending on a regular basis, as they do in the brick and mortar world.
And I would add it. Thank you, Dr. McMahon. That's exactly right. As Dr. McMahon said, we've not gotten direction from the state. The state has the attendance rules, the attendance laws. They will dictate to us what attendance means in the virtual world, or a hybrid world. And so myself, the other superintendents, are waiting for that information from Maryland State Department of Education. But regardless, the expectation is that students are engaged, whatever the rules are. And so, as Dr. McMahon said, we have those mechanisms in place. It's the counselor, it's the teacher, it's the assistant principal, it's the principal, it's the PPW, it's the social worker. Those are the folks that are reaching out and sometimes physically knocking on doors when a student doesn't come to school, whether it's virtually or otherwise. Those mechanisms are still in place because we want the students engaged.
Right. Bless you.
Thank you.
I have two more questions. Let's say we all go back. If at the state level, they can close all schools. But if we all go back and there is concern at a particular school, then it falls back to you, Dr. Arlotto, and the school system to determine how to manage that particular school. So, for example, if there's an outbreak, I'll use my favorite, meat, right? Does the entire cluster close down? Does the school close down? Does the system close down? What is the plan for that if there is a worst case scenario, and forbid it if it happens, but if there's a COVID outbreak?
So it would not be up to me, the local school superintendent. Those rules are going to have to be set at the state level and by the medical community. Just like if it were any other, put COVID aside, if it were tuberculosis or something else that a student contracted, we would be in touch with our local health department, who's in touch with the CDC. They then would give us direction about what to do, how to clean the building, how to isolate children. Do we need to close a building? Do we not need to close a building? Do we close the cluster? So I just want to make that really clear that it would not be up to me. I don't make medical decisions. I have to rely on the medical community. But you ask a great question. And in fact, I had a conversation earlier this week with Dr. Kalyana Raman, who is the chief medical officer here for Anne Arundel County. And I asked him that exact question. I said, what are you thinking if and when we go back in some form or fashion, we've got children and staff back in a building, and there appears to be, use the term outbreak, but even if there's just one case, if I have one child or one adult in that building has tested positive, what will be your advice? How do we react? He doesn't have a definitive answer, but his response was, well, George, we'll take it, of course, on a case-by-case basis, but if it is a single student or a single staff member, we would isolate them, and we would probably isolate that class. It all depends on how many students that in the contact tracing did that student or staff come in contact with. That would dictate, do you quarantine that entire class? Maybe that grade. If that student or staff member didn't, if they were, I'm going to make this up, for example, just to expand your example, Ms. Antoine, it's a second grade teacher in a second grade class, and they didn't come in contact with any of the third, fourth, or fifth graders, then the advice would be for us to not not quarantine them, but it would be to maybe quarantine that class. But if it turned out to be multiple cases in a school or in a cluster, then we might have to look at shutting down the school or shutting down multiple schools. And that will of course be on the advice of the medical community. I will also add, because I think it's a good time to do that, that Dr. Kalyana Raman, I think, has done a fantastic job of helping manage this crisis in Anne Arundel County. I think his team has been phenomenal, and his team includes our school nurses. They have been on the front lines in contact tracing because, of course, schools have been closed and our health rooms have been closed. All of that medical staff in the schools, all our school nurses and aides have been used by model the state. One of the things is having available, not public, it would be available to students and staff in that building. Should somebody become sick, Dr. Kalyana Raman and his team would have the ability to do COVID testing within our buildings. That's not a done deal. That's something that
again, we accept that, right? Could we set up a portal for maybe recommendations and concerns from the parents and the community as we move forward in the fall that could inform the way we do business in the spring or the following fall? Something that they could put in comments, questions, concerns. They can identify what clusters they're in. For example, we talked about childcare. Identify what those concerns are based on the outcomes that we're looking at as we move into the fall. Dr. Lotto, I can't hear you.
My apologies. I think the short answer is yes. We have some of that now. So as parents are emailing us with their questions, their concerns, their statements about how they intend for the fall to go, we are sharing that with the committee. So the appropriate committee is getting that information, and so they're able to see what parents are saying. We're getting lots of emails from lots of different folks about how they think the fall should open. And as you would imagine, and would be no surprise to you and your colleagues, Ms. Antoine on the board, that it's from soup to nuts. It's from A to Z. No way can you open without a vaccine to you must open 5 days a week with a full classroom and everything in between.
Excellent. Well, thank you both.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Antoine. Mr. Gilliland?
Thank you, Madam President, and Dr. Arlotto, Dr. McMahon. Thank you again for this. These plans are not easy to put together, nor are they easy to implement. So I appreciate the work that's unfolding. I think Mr. Smith asked one of the questions I was going to ask, and I know athletics is not the paramount topic for today, but I am getting a lot of questions about that throughout the community, and I appreciate your response, and certainly Mr. Smith. I think President Corkadell said it best. We appreciate you being here and your candor and sense of humor. One comment that I'll make, and then I do have a question, perhaps an unfair question as it relates to funding, but a comment, and Dr. Arlotto, I think you said it best, that we can't please everybody, and I would even further add to that, if we try to please everybody, we're going to fail. That's just a doomsday waiting to happen. But to the extent possible, when we have parents or families with multiple children in the school system, and if there is an on-day, off-day type scenario planned, to the extent possible, that can be, a consideration that, if parents have to work, on alternate means for daycare, et cetera, that, all the kids are in school on X day and Y day. I think it just makes it easier for those families. Again, I know that's one variable in a whole bowl of soup, but, to the extent that can be a factor or consideration, I think that would help families. My question, again, I think it is an unfair question for today, but I'll just throw it out because it's a question, but probably more of a concern. And that is as well thought out as this plan is, and I know it's still in development. We're going to move to implementation and valuation, and certainly various versions of improvement to the plan as it unfolds. How much of this plan, as it's written today, is going to be jeopardized should the Board of Public Works have further funding reductions during its August meeting? And why I raise this today, as those funding cuts or potential reductions come into play in August, we're so much closer to the finish line to opening school in whatever format it is, and that can just throw a well thought out plan into the shredder. So I ask it, again, mostly as a concern, knowing that it's an unfair question that you may not be able to answer wholly today, and just raise it again also so that we're looking at potential, God forbid, plan B, C, D, whatever, to mitigate the funding loss risk that I think is very likely to happen. That was a ramble, and I apologize.
No, that's a, so to go back to the beginning, Mr. Gillen, we are not going to be able to please everybody. And so we're going to work to make decisions that we think are in the best interest of our students and our staffs. And it's going to be in the best interest of health and safety and of equity. That's what's leading our charge. That's what's leading our best thinking. And I know that we are not going to be able to please everybody, because not everybody sends their child to school from the same circumstances. And so we know that, but we'll continue to move forward as best we can in terms of making those decisions. Regarding your budget question, it's a good one. And the short answer is, I don't know exactly how it's going to impact, but the governor, the Board of Public Works, and then eventually what's going to have to go, as you well know, to the state legislature to make the decisions about the larger budget piece and cuts that we will see. I absolutely believe that we'll see some cuts in our FY21 and the board's FY21 budget. There's no doubt in my mind that we're going to see some cuts. We're going to feel some pain, and we're going to have to make some difficult decisions. That said, in terms of juxtapositioning that or overlaying that with how we're going to reopen, some of the things that we're going to need to reopen differently, we're going to be utilizing some of the federal CARES funds, and that's going to help us out, right? It's not going to be impacted by the state funds because they're federal CARES funds. So in terms of purchasing technology and getting to one-to-one, that's going to help us do that. In terms of buying some of the PPE that we're going to need, hand sanitizers, hand washing stations, face masks, some of those things to open in some way, shape, or form, we're going to be able to purchase some of that through the CARES federal funding, which again will not be impacted by a loss in state funding. But there will be a loss in state funding, and that could have a trickle-down effect in many of our different departments.
I appreciate that. And again, I am so appreciative of the CARES funding, but as you well know, and Mr. Shaknovich and the entire board, that's one-time funding.
Correct.
And, I don't see that as a recurring, maybe something will happen and there's a phase 2 or 3 of that. But, I just also know that once we start to do something and spend money on something, there's an expectation among the public, let's just call it that, what you've done it once, you got to continue to do it. And then the school system's on the hook. And then I know that's got implications for future funding, for funding streams and budgets. So I appreciate your answer, again, knowing full well that it was an unfair question. But, again, I just raise it as a concern because I think a lot of things are up in the air as we look at the Board of Public Works and then the future BRFA that the General Assembly is going to have to consider. But again, lastly, I'll just say I appreciate this presentation, part one and part two of it today. A lot of thought and efforts going into it and a lot of volunteerism, I think, from the community at large is making this come to fruition, and I think quite well at that. So thank you, Dr. Arlotto. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gilliland. Mr. Lott?
I'd just like to thank Dr. Arlotto, Dr. McMahon, and I know so many others contributed such a very thorough and thoughtful presentation. As far as questions and comments, I believe my colleagues have pretty well covered the waterfront, so I will defer at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lott. We have two more questions from board members that emerged for them in the course of our inquiries, and that is Mr. Smith and Ms. Schallheim. So we're going to go Mr. Smith first, and then Ms. Schallheim, and should be in good shape. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, President Corkadell, and thank you for taking this last question. But it's about grading. No matter how we send the students back to school, we want to make sure that they're actually taking in learning. So how will we be evaluating that with grades?
That's a great question, and one the committees are really dealing with, because in a virtual world, even though we'll be back fully in a synchronous environment, you still want things to work well. You don't want to overburden and overtax. So there's a lot of discussion going on right now in the committees about not to the level of 1 grade a week, by no means, but do we talk about grading and simplifying the nature of grading a little bit and really making it more streamlined across the district? That's a lot of conversation going on to make it easier to understand and easier for students to know what's due when, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a good question, and one that a lot of people are giving a lot of thought to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Schallheim.
Yes, I had a question. I'm so sorry that I forgot to ask this before, but with regard to cultural art, and I'm glad that this is important to other parents because it's also important to me. I'm a fan of the arts, music, etc., and arts and music education, of course. And so how, I know that Dr. Arlotto and I talked about this very briefly the other day, but how will, say, a cultural arts teacher that has hundreds of students, which is different than a homeroom teacher that has 30, how will we limit their exposure, and kind of how will that work if we're in an in-person environment in any form or fashion?
Right, it's a good question. At the elementary level, of course, that looks a little different than at the secondary level, but still the cultural arts people often have large class loads. Absolutely true. At the elementary level, there's a cultural arts group, there's a family, right? Including art and music and Triple E in those schools that have Triple E and physical education, health, et cetera, right? So they operate as a family, and that's worked really quite well. And they're talking about not only putting up those robust offerings, they offered some of the most robust offerings in the springtime. Not only are they talking about continuing that good work, but also integrating the work a little bit more so that a student may have a project or may have an experience that's both music and art oriented, or that incorporates the arts into a Triple E experience. So it is a good question. It's one we're thinking about, and just to brag a bit, I think we might have the most amazing cultural arts teachers, in the state of Maryland. They really are recognized statewide as leaders, and it shows. And so I know that the quality will stay high no matter how we go back to school in the fall.
Okay, great. I concur. My daughter's experience with cultural arts this spring was nothing short of fabulous. So thank you, Folger McKenzie Cultural Arts Department. A little shout out. With regard to things like band, and yes, I'm taking some personal privilege. I have a rising fourth grader who has been playing trumpet for a year and has been dying to start playing band. So I speak for that specific thing. I could see, I mean, we do virtual trumpet lessons now, and it's hard, but it's not impossible. Could there be, obviously in person would be better, but are you all thinking about a virtual environment for those sorts of things where they're not blowing droplets across the room?
Right.
It'll be in
Absolutely.
their own house. Yeah.
Absolutely. The virtual environment, and I think it was Miss Ellis talked about some of the things that we piloted in the spring of being able to bring students together to work on a composition, whether it's choral or instrumental, simultaneously. I know Meade had an amazing experience in their graduation with a choral piece done. A combination of people coming together across the internet. So it can be done. We're also, we're watching just like everyone is. If we bring students back in any fashion for sports and co-curricular clubs, maybe there's an opportunity to bring some students back for small sectionals. They would have to be socially distant. It wouldn't be exactly like a large band, but it would be something socially that would engage them in their music talents. So both the virtual and the in-person world's being looked at.
I'm really glad to hear that because, there's so much data that says, that music education, arts education helps students out in other areas. I'm glad that our state recognized. I'm not at all surprised. My final bit, and I'm really sorry, this always happens. With regard to Chromebook delivery, we're blessed in the sense that my daughter has an old laptop that she's been using for the spring, so she didn't get a Chromebook yet. So for that population where they've had a device that they've been able to use, they'll eventually, once all the other populations have been dealt with, they'll be also then receiving their Chromebook.
Correct.
Okay. Great. And then my final thing is with regard to outside instruction and use of the outdoors as a learning environment and for decompression and unstructured play. I'm all about it. I'm really glad we're thinking about it. We have some wonderful courtyards and spaces that I feel are underutilized in our county and in our schools. And this is a wonderful time for us to hit the reset button, think about how we think about education on the whole. And really, I'm just going to be optimistic about it. Come out of this with being even better, really utilizing that space for education and for health and fitness more than we already do so wonderfully. And so I'm really glad that you all are thinking about that. And with that, I will yield the floor. I'm good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have one more question. This is definitely an important thing for everybody. So just bear with us, folks. We have one more question from Mr. Grannon. Mr. Grannon, at your convenience.
Thank you, President Corkle. I just want to understand from Dr. Alato, I guess it's kind of a two-part question. The plan that you're planning to roll out by the end of the month, if there hasn't been an indication from, well, the first question is, does that plan get first kind of pre-cleared by the superintendent before you announce it?
So my understanding is that we will have to have our reopening plans approved by Maryland State Department of Education. All the counties in the Maryland will have to submit a plan that's approved by the Maryland Department of Education.
Okay, so that answers that part. What I guess I'm struggling with a little bit is how could we have a plan that has, let's say, for example, kids back in school 100% of the time or even 50% of the time if there hasn't been an indication yet from the state superintendent that schools will in fact reopen?
I don't know. I mean, I am hoping that the state superintendent makes a decision in a very short period of time here in the next week or so so that we can really hone in on, myself and all my colleagues around the state can really hone in on what our option is going to be, or options, and then put that out to our public. So
Okay,
I've got to rely to some degree on the State Department of Education giving us the okay that schools will open and in what parameters they will be allowed to open.
That's what I guess I was trying to pin down, with all the, usual caveats about this is not your decision, it's above your pay grade, all that stuff. You have factored in to your projected timeline of announcing a plan by the end of the month, your hope and expectation that there will be some guidance as to what you are allowed to do.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. That wasn't coming through to me before, but now I understand. Thank you. That's it.
Okay. Thank you guys very, very much. I know there was perhaps a little bit more questions than anticipated, but I think us and the public all learned a vast amount about what we know and what we don't know. And sounds like we've got a team effort underway, and I'm confident that we will make best decisions based on our circumstances. Thank you all so very much. I know you're burning the midnight oil on this. Okay.